Okay, well, first of all, why another protocol? Why another plan? Well, cap and trade and carbon taxes are primarily designed to deal with the problem of climate change, which is a strategy to deal with an end-of-tailpipe problem. Peak oil is a problem with what is going into the fuel tank and needs to be dealt with in that way. It's a supply problem, and it's also a problem of adaptation and planning. And while climate protection strategies are essential and have to continue and will overlap with peak oil mitigation strategies, it's also important to acknowledge that the latter is a different kind of problem in some respects and will have to have some separate consideration. Fuel taxes, higher carbon taxes or gasoline taxes are, in my opinion, a good idea. I would certainly support them. However, in the context of peak oil, with the likelihood of very high and volatile gasoline prices, it's going to be very politically difficult to get those higher fuel taxes. Also, cap and trade addresses emissions and not supply problems and the instability and vulnerability that those will create. So the oil depletion protocol is designed specifically to deal with the vulnerability from supply constraints and to help us in adapting to a post-peak regime and plan for it. Now, without an oil depletion protocol, what are we facing? We've really been talking about that in some detail, actually, the last couple of days. We will see not just high prices, but extreme price volatility. And that's a very bad thing because it undercuts our ability to make the large long-term investments in new infrastructure that will be required. Also, as we heard from Michael Clare, conflict over the world's remaining oil supplies is extremely likely and grows more likely with the reality of peak oil. And that has to be avoided if we're going to adapt successfully. And finally, if we fail to prepare and plan, as Roger Bezdek has said, then that will leave our societies open to economic disruption and potentially even collapse. So the general direction in which we need to go is pretty clear. We need an agreement to gradually, cooperatively reduce our oil consumption for a variety of reasons, to discourage competition, stabilize prices, and aid with planning and preparation. And it would be really helpful if the rate of reduction were pegged to something objective so as to reduce the time needed for negotiation over reduction rates. Now, when I say this general direction is clear, I'm talking about agreement across the political spectrum. Here's Christine Milne, the Green Party member of the Australian Senate, saying the overwhelming thing we need is a national plan to deal with oil depletion. And over on the right of the political spectrum, Republican Governor George Pataki of New York saying foreign oil's undeniable ties to terror, global instability, and continued environmental degradation make immediate decisive action to reduce our petroleum consumption absolutely critical. And here is President George W. Bush saying America is addicted to oil and we've got to wean ourselves off of petroleum. Well, that is the purpose of the oil depletion protocol, is to wean us off of petroleum directly and in a planned manner. The oil depletion protocol was first suggested by Dr. Colin Campbell, the founder of ASPO, and probably the single individual who's done most to alert the world over the last 10 years to the problem of global oil production peak. It's been known by several other names in previous incarnations, and currently the Post-Carbon Institute has developed a program for gaining the adoption of the protocol globally. Now here's the essence, the guts of the works. Really this third item here is where what it all comes down to. No country shall import at above the world depletion rate. So what's the world depletion rate? Well, it's the annual production over the amount that's left to produce. And we don't know exactly what that is, but best guess estimate is about 2.5%. In other words, we're using about 2.5% of the world's remaining oil reserves every year. Now, this protocol is designed to be one size fits all across the board. There are no special provisions for less industrialized countries. Why not? It seems very unfair. Well, we have to understand what the protocol is designed, the problem the protocol is designed to solve. During the 20th century, more oil usage generally meant more economic growth. The more oil you used, the better economy you had. During the 21st century, we face almost a mirror image problem in a way. More oil usage means more oil dependence, which means more vulnerability to high and volatile prices, geopolitical conflict, and shortages. So the oil depletion protocol is designed to reduce that vulnerability by reducing oil dependence. So that's a problem shared equally by all nations, and the oil depletion protocol, therefore, is equally useful to all nations. Now, the equity problem is real. I think there are better ways of solving it, like for already industrialized countries to share renewable energy technologies with less industrialized countries, free of intellectual property rights for domestic implementation, and that's what I would recommend. So how do you prevent cheating? How do we know real oil reserves and so on? Well, every international protocol involves setting up some kind of mechanism, usually a secretariat, to monitor these sorts of things. And so this wouldn't require breaking any new ground or creating something that's never existed before. A side benefit of all of this is that nations adopting the protocol would be required to submit to an independent audit of their reserves, imports, exports, and production figures. How are we going to get better data? Well, this is one way of doing it. Now, Michael Meacher, member of the British Parliament, says the proposal to cut oil imports to match depletion rate seems to be simple common sense. And I think once anyone examines this protocol, they're likely to come up with a similar assessment. What would it achieve? Well, if it were generally adopted by many nations, the oil depletion protocol would stabilize prices. Prices would be high, but we need high prices in order to incentivize adaptation. But we need high prices, but more than that, we need stable prices. And this is one of the few ways I can think of, really the only way I can think of achieving that. It would also discourage conflict over resources, and in the end, it would leave some oil in the ground. And if you think about it, oil is a unique resource in all of the world and all of human history. And what we're doing with it is to extract it as quickly as possible and burn it all. It seems the least intelligent thing we could possibly do, having encountered this stuff. How about leaving some for future generations? Maybe they may find something more intelligent to do with it. It would also establish a precedent for dealing with other depleting fossil fuels. The idea is not that the oil depletion protocol would solve all of our problems. Obviously, other fossil fuels need to be dealt with as well. Now, if the oil depletion protocol were only adopted by one or two or very few nations, some of these first benefits would not be fully achieved. However, those nations that did adopt the protocol would benefit from it because they would have a leg up in adapting to the post-peak world. If we adapt early, then we have a range of options to assess and to choose from. We can choose how we're going to make our path toward a post-petroleum world. If we wait until the peak is upon us, then we have to use whatever provisional, improvised responses are available and in short order, and we'll make more mistakes. So what's in it for the producing countries? Now, according to the terms of the protocol, producing countries would also reduce their production by their national depletion rates. How could you possibly talk producing countries into doing that? Well, revenues would remain high because prices would be high. But there would be the incentive to prepare for the end of oil now by diversifying economies. And most oil-producing nations have very simple economies. They're depending upon oil exports for most of their economic resources, and that they know is unsustainable. So here's the incentive to begin to change that. And we have to remember, oil production is going to decline anyway. It's not as though we have a choice between reducing our reliance on oil or not reducing our reliance on oil and being able to increase that forever. The choice only is whether we reduce our reliance on oil in a cooperative fashion or we simply let nature take its course and compete over the last few drops. Also, if importers adopt the oil depletion protocol, if this is generally adopted, producers will benefit because there will be less likelihood of wealthy, powerful importing nations wanting or needing to control economic and political affairs within poorer, less powerful producing nations. So it's very much in their interest to promote the oil depletion protocol. So, okay, assuming we decide cooperatively that we'll use less oil, how do we do that? How do we adapt? Well, there's no prescription in the protocol itself as to how individual nations would do that because every nation has its own unique pattern of oil dependence and its own opportunities for substitution. And really, there are only two broad general categories for adaptation. That's substitution and conservation, efficiency and curtailment. The areas in which we need to address conservation are, of course, transportation, agriculture, chemicals and plastics, and urban design. So all of these things would have to be worked out. However, an important tool that I think could be used, again, this is not an element of the oil depletion protocol, but I think it's a very promising policy tool, is some form of domestic quota rationing. Now, we will see fuel rationing in the years ahead, one way or another, whether it's price rationing or quota rationing. In the case of a very important resource that's becoming more and more scarce, price rationing, I think, would be very unfair and very economically, socially, and politically disruptive. Quota rationing could work very well. It's worked in the past. During World War II, we had fuel rationing here. In Britain, they even had food rationing, and people during World War II in Great Britain were actually better nourished under the food rationing program than they had been during the Great Depression or were during the early 1950s. So this is a proposal by David Fleming of Great Britain for tradable energy quotas. The fuel rations of World War II were not transferable, not tradable, whereas if we used credit card technology and the market mechanism, I think we'd achieve some benefit. At the beginning of every year, every adult would receive free a yearly quota for, let's say, gasoline. Still have to buy the gasoline at the pump, but the quota would be free, and you surrender the quota via credit card as you're purchasing the fuel. Now, those who, and every year that quota would be reduced by 2.5% under the terms of the protocol. So you'd know your quota next year would be a little less, and the next year a little less than that. So there'd be every incentive to begin to adapt now. Buy the smaller car, ride your bicycle more, move closer to where you work. And then the energy conservers, the energy misers, who did those things would have some extra quotas at the end of the year that they could sell and benefit from financially. Those who insisted on continuing to burn up lots of miles in large vehicles would run out of quotas halfway through the year and have to buy some on the market. So this would be an ongoing transfer of wealth from the energy guzzlers in society to the energy misers using a market mechanism to reinforce behavior that would actually be in everyone's best interest. Okay, so even if we agree that maybe this is a good idea on paper, how could the oil depletion protocol possibly ever be adopted? It sounds so counterintuitive to what policymakers around the world are already attuned to. Well, already the nation of Sweden has realized that its dependence on oil is a vulnerability, and they have made the goal of reducing their reliance on oil to zero by 2020. Iceland has done something similar, and so has Cuba. And I think we'll see that list of nations growing rather rapidly. Kuwait is an interesting case because it's a producing nation, of course, and the Kuwaiti parliament having been tipped off to the fact that maybe Kuwait's actual oil reserves may only be half of what they've been telling the rest of the world, the Kuwaiti parliament, hearing that, has said, well, my goodness, if that's true, why are we extracting and exporting our oil at maximum rates? Shouldn't we be cutting back so that our children and grandchildren have some basis for an economy? So Kuwait is talking about, in effect, reducing production to match depletion rate, which is exactly what it would be doing under the terms of the protocol. Declining producers, and there's a long list of them, about 30, are already, at least in that respect, in de facto compliance with the terms of the protocol, whether they want to be or not, whether they've ever heard of the protocol or not. The same with poor nations that are unable to afford to import oil at $60 or $70 a barrel. We're seeing declining demand in those nations. Now, they can adopt the protocol without any penalty and turn necessity into a virtue and politically thereby exert pressure on the wealthy importing nations to do the same thing. And that's really the point of the protocol, is to change the behavior of the wealthy importing nations. Well, what's the number one nation in that regard? The US. What are the chances of Washington buying into the oil depletion protocol? Seemingly zero. Well, so what do we do here in the United States? We operate at the regional, local, and state level, where there's a much greater possibility of action. We've already seen a number of states here in the US adopt the Kyoto Protocol, even though Washington is balking. Same thing is happening with regard to oil depletion, with peak oil in communities around this country. This is not an exhaustive list. There's a very long list of municipalities in the US that are studying their vulnerability to peak oil and beginning to formulate plans for reducing their dependence on petroleum, starting with cities like San Francisco, which has already endorsed the oil depletion protocol, as has Bloomington, Indiana. Smaller towns like Willits, California, Sebastopol, California, Oakland, California, which is not a small city, has just followed the lead of Sweden and vowed to become petroleum-free by 2020 in all of its municipal operations. This, again, is a trend that is snowballing. None of this was happening 2 years ago. The oil depletion protocol can be implemented at any level of society, from the international level to the state, regional level, also by individuals, and I think there's an important pressure point here. All it takes is for individuals to assess how much oil they're using and then make a plan to reduce that by 2.5% to 3% per year. And we in North America can do that easily. And on the oildepletionprotocol.org website, we are preparing a kind of petroleum calculator. So by answering a few simple questions about how many miles you drive and what kind of car, how many miles you fly per year, what kind of food you eat, and so on, you can determine just how many discretionary barrels of oil consumption you're responsible for. And then the calculator will also help you toggle to see how you could save 2.5% to 3% of oil consumption most easily and quickly. Now, these individual efforts won't mean much unless they're publicized. Because if we publicize them, then that puts pressure on politicians. It says this is an idea that has legs in the public. We know that the public regards energy security as its #1 concern, and this is a way of achieving that. So it also says this is doable. How do we know? Because we, the public, are already doing it. We're reducing our oil reliance by 3% per year. So this oil depletion protocol adoption effort is itself just getting off the ground. But we're starting to formulate the plan as to how we're going to promote it. The first year's goal is simply to raise awareness. Right now, virtually no one in the world knows what an oil depletion protocol is. We have to change that. We have to get to the point where when the average person is asked, do you know what the oil depletion protocol is, they would at least say, well, I've heard of it. I don't know exactly what it is, but it sounds familiar. Then by the second year, there's the possibility, I think, of adoption by at least one nation. And we, of course, will be looking for the low-hanging fruit here, countries like Sweden, Iceland, and so on. And in the third and fourth years, adoption by several nations. By the fifth year, We're hoping for a convention of nations that would discuss the protocol, form a secretariat, or perhaps a discussion of the protocol at the United Nations. Obviously, this is not going to be accomplished by Post-Carbon Institute or by Richard Heinberg giving lectures all over the country. This has got to be a much larger cooperative venture involving many organizations and many people. Okay, well, what if this doesn't work? What if no nation adopts the oil depletion protocol? Well, even in that case, our effort will not have gone for naught, because even discussing the oil depletion protocol requires going into the problem of global oil depletion. What's that about? What does that mean? Even the idea of a global oil depletion rate is a new idea for most policymakers. Oh, you mean we're using 2.5% of the world's oil every year? Wow. What does that mean? Well, we can go into the implications of that. And as I said earlier, this protocol can be adopted at any level of society, and whoever adopts it, whether it's a few thousand individuals and families and homes, or a few cities, or a couple of nations, or the world as a whole, whoever adopts it is going to benefit from it by being able to plan their energy transition rather than simply being caught up in the chaos of the post-peak economy. I'd like to finish with two slides. One is a statement of Ed Schrier, the Governor General of Canada. He says the very idea of accepting oil depletion protocols and treaties to guard against irresponsible levels of emissions may not be popular or easily endorsable, yet in the annals of history it's clear that epochal crises must be faced. The question is whether they're met with intelligence, resolve, and sacrifice, or whether decision makers procrastinate to everyone's eventual peril and suffering. That's a pretty good summary of the situation. And finally, I just say, this next energy transition, humankind has seen several watershed energy transitions in its history, the most recent one having been the fossil-fueled industrial revolution. This next energy transition, the transition away from fossil fuels, is the challenge of our generation, of our lifetime, and of this century. The challenge of global climate change makes a shift away from fossil fuels absolutely necessary for planetary survival, and the impending peak in oil and gas production means that the transition is inevitable. Our only choice is whether to undertake it proactively and cooperatively or to put it off at our peril. So peak oil provides us with an opportunity and a spur to action, and may we accept that challenge. Thank you very much.